Hi, and welcome. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you a little bit about the newest WIDA ELD standards in the 2020 edition that is specifically for K-12 students. So our conversation today will really look at the fourth WIDA edition. My name is Mariela Allen, and I am a former WIDA consultant and trainer, and also am a K-12 educator. I specifically work with newcomer or duly identified or duly considered students. I come to you today from Denver, Colorado. In addition to my work with newcomer students, I own a nonprofit organization called EduLiber, and we look forward to continuing to support and serve educators and students that are multilingual language learners. First, you'll notice that I'm going to be utilizing today the language MLL, or multilingual language learners, which is a reflection of some of the changes in the WIDA framework, looking at our students from this asset-based perspective as multilingual language learners, looking at their all the great assets that they bring to our classrooms. So today we're going to focus on the fourth WIDA edition. This fourth edition is a reflection of the collaboration between states and districts and schools, content educators and language educators, and also a collaboration between school administrators and the students that they support and serve. The focus of these changes is really to make language development explicit and integrated into content. And one of the most notable changes, specifically in this edition, is the elevation of the status of language education into the general education program. This way, language education is not seen necessarily as isolated or an isolated entity or an one-off, but rather as part of the Multilingual Language Learners Day. The other notable difference is the reflection of collaboration of all educators. So the work of supporting our multilingual language learners is to ensure that they have equitable access for their students throughout their students' school day. One of the things that I want to highlight here is that the WIDA ELD standards are not, right? These standards are specific goals for language learners across all 4 language domains in a K-12 setting. The new framework really continues to exemplify both linguistically and culturally sustainable view of language development. This framework can be used in conjunction with other resources and really is not considered a standalone resource. Rather, it's a compendium of resources for our multilingual language learners whom may be developing multi-languages simultaneously. It's also important to point out that the WIDA ELD standards and framework are not. It's not the language of school in its entirety, and it is not possible really to capture all of what is essential for the success of multilingual language learners. It's not a teaching approach, it's not a pedagogy, and it is not a curriculum or a series of lessons. Rather, this WIDA 2020 ELD framework is a toolbox of resources to really support and elevate our educators to best serve their K-12 students. Some of the components that you will find in the new WIDA ELD standards include this notion of building on ideas and concepts from existing resources and also prior editions. This is the 4th edition. It also addresses latest theories, practice, and policy. It also incorporates some ideas and feedback from educators around the world. And it also is in compliance with all federal requirements that are under ESSA and serve as the foundation for systems that foster students engaged and interactive learning and the collaboration between educator practice. So let's go ahead and dive in. Some of the most important things here you'll notice on your screen are these 4 really crucial big ideas for the 2020 edition. Each of the 4 themes, if you look closely, converge around this really centralized idea of supporting K-12 multilingual language learners to find success in school. The 4 big ideas are student-centric, they're culturally and linguistically responsive, and they focus on our students from an asset-based or strength-based approach. The first one that I'd like to highlight here is that notion of teaching language and content together. We know that our multilingual language learners really bring a number of advantages, both linguistic and cultural capital to our classrooms. We know that multilingual language learners should be able to access content in multimodal ways. So this is really beyond just a text-based engagement, but learning and extending with rich opportunities for not only content connections, but also connections with regards to language and oracy, and also opportunities for our students to engage with content that is graphic or supported visually or even digitally to ensure that equitable access to information. The focus is also an integration, if you notice here, with the integration of content and language. We know that it's best practice to ensure our students make those connections to content through rich learning and language opportunities. The other thing that you'll notice here is some other pieces around that equity for multilingual learners, in addition to that collaboration amongst key stakeholders. And the last thing that I'd like to highlight here that is exciting in this newest edition is that functional approach to language development. We know that standards emphasize language and serve, that opportunity to serve both social and emotional purposes. So in this 2020 edition, the focus is on that notion that language is used for a variety of audiences and various situations. So our functional approach to language development for students help our students to make choices in order to make meaning. And we know that students interact with other students in the classroom environment, and they also have that opportunity to use language in rich, authentic dialogue. It ensures our students gain language proficiency from these rich experiences. So now where we're going to move is taking a look at some of the things that do remain the same. So from previous editions, this is the fourth edition, that can-do philosophical approach continues to remain the foundation of the WIDA framework. It really, again, as I have mentioned before, emphasizes that asset-based approach to the potential of our multilingual language learners. The 5 original WIDA ELD standard statements remain the same. The 6 levels of language proficiency remain the same, but you'll also notice that there is that continuum because students learn language in different rates and at different speeds, depending on the domain and also depending on the content area. The other thing that you'll notice that remains the same and consistent in this edition is those grade level clusters. So let's dig in. So again, you'll notice here, those can-do statements remain the same. So you'll notice that each of the 5 standards are staying the same in this newest edition. As I mentioned again, those language proficiencies will remain the same, proficiency level 1 all the way to a proficiency level 6. And then again here are those 6 grade level clusters, which correspond to, to the WIDA access assessment, okay, for language learners. So let's talk about some of the updates. One of the things that you'll notice in the new 2020 edition is it's reorganized into these 4 components, and we're going to dig in a little bit here. We'll also look at some of the grade level cluster materials that help our educators understand both language function and features, but also with very specific language samples. So let's dig in. One of the things that we notice as we see these WIDA ELD standards is that overarching conceptual framework of language and content right at the very top here. The next kind of layer is language usage, right? It's that prominent language use across content area. The next layer, if you kind of look down, is language expectations, and that's really looking at helping our educators provide goals for content to drive our language instruction. And then if we look now to the next layer, it's really those proficiency level descriptors. Again, noticing that it is a continuum of language development across all 4 language domains. So let's dig into these standards. K-12 education, as we know, has really undergone a lot of changes. And WIDA continues to align to the current practice and policy and theory around English language development. So these standards remain the same since the 2004 edition. But what you'll notice here is that there's that word "for" highlighted. And it reflects back on one of those four big ideas, that functional approach to language development within that sociocultural context. We know that learning language is a dynamic process and that language changes and shifts depending upon environment, depending upon context, depending upon engagement with different purposes as students are speaking with different people. Language is used as that action, as a set of tools to really help make meaning in the ways of not only disciplines, but also concepts and practices. So then the focus is language for thinking and for doing and for producing. One of the things that I really want to highlight here that often I get questions about is ELD standard number 1, language for social and instructional processes and purposes. In this new edition, it continues to represent language being an integral part of social and instructional experiences for our multilingual learners in school. When we look at this standard, there's a focus on how students interact with one another, also how students can both offer and gain multiple perspectives, that our students can problem solve and investigate in a range of topics and issues. So standard 1 is really that opportunity to apply a range and to apply to a range of educational settings. We know that our students learn not only the language of school, but also how to communicate in a variety of different settings, how to convey their personal needs and wants, to affirm their identity, to form and maintain relationship. So standard 1 works independently, but it also works in conjunction with all of the other WIDA standards 2 through 5 to support language in the content area. It's also important here to note that standard 1 is just not for the newcomer student or even the early learner, but rather it's kind of a precursor to learning disciplinary specific language. So let's dig into some of the updated key uses. You'll notice that the key language uses is something that was part of the other additions. But the key language uses are really select genre families that appear across all content areas. So narrate, inform, explain, argue. So the key language uses summarize kind of prominent language that we see across all disciplines, which help our us as educators organize and coordinate instruction. So it's reflective of that WIDA analysis of academic content standards and where there is so much language that students use in school. So we know that the key uses recur across all disciplines and across all of K-12 schooling. So the key uses really take that broad idea of language that students might interact with in school and inform how educators organize and plan for instruction. So let's dig into some of those key uses. They reflect basically that high leverage language in a school setting. So if you're familiar with the other key uses, you will notice that the 2020 version are just slightly updated. The first one is narrate. So when we look at narrate, we're really thinking about that highlight of language to represent the real or imaginary experience of our students through either story or history. Let's look at inform. So it really highlights the language that students need to provide factual information. So in order for students to convey information, they may need to describe or compare and contrast, categorize, organize, maybe classify concepts or ideas or even a phenomenon in science. The next key use that we'll kind of take a quick peek at is the explain. So that really highlights the language that our students will need to account for why something happens or how things work. So this key language use is often associated with maybe sequential language or causal language, or even cyclical or consequential explanations. We might find Are students using that explain in a science or even in a math class in which they have determined the answer, but also are required to identify how they came to that answer? The last one that we're going to highlight here is argue. And that really highlights the language that students need to develop a claim and even a counterclaim for students to provide some convincing evidence to substantiate their thinking. And under that key uses argue, students might actually write a critical response, they might write a book review, they might record a Flipgrid video that highlights their thinking and or a response to even a mathematic process or even a scientific argument. So the focus here with these key uses updated version is not really to limit instruction, but rather to highlight some of the most prominent language across both grade levels and disciplines. So let's see this in action. So as you can see here with these new grade level language expectations, one of the other considerations that's kind of new in the framework, just to think about really quickly, is that movement from individual language domains, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, but rather you'll see in this newest edition, the 2020 edition, a consolidation of communication. So when we think about that inclusive mode of communication, we think about expressive language. And when we think about expressive language, we are thinking about speaking, writing, and representing. And then the other mode of communication is expressive. And we're thinking there, is interpretive. And we're thinking about listening, reading, and viewing. So with these two broader modes of communication, it really increases accessibility and options for students. It also, again, goes back to some of the things we've talked about before in that multimodal form of communication. We know that our students communicate through words, but they also communicate through gestures or through facial expressions, through images that they create, through equations, maybe through maps or timelines or symbols. So these multimodal ways of engaging are not just a form of support for developing language, but it's also an essential way for our students to continue to make meaning using language. And to have, it also helps us to remind that our students, we really want them to engage and interpret, represent, and act. One of the things that I wanted to highlight here is as we look at these language expectations, these are here to help us as educators with goals. They're content-driven language instruction. They're aligned to our English language development standard statements. They include those key language uses. And then it provides an opportunity for students to kind of drive language instruction along with content instruction. So as we look at these language expectations, they're really to help us identify what our students need to do with language specifically to meet that academic content expectation. They're similar statements to what we might find actually in academic content standards. So if you look here, you'll see that there are lots of different ways to utilize these standards. So in this example that you have on your screen, you can see the ELD or English Language Development Statement. You can see that it's focused on language arts. You can see the focus is at grade level 2-3, but you can also see that the key language use is narrate, okay? And the mode of communication is expressive. So what we're asking is that our multilingual language learners construct a language art, maybe narrative, that orient an audience to context, to develop the story, maybe with time and also event sequences, right? An opportunity for students to explore maybe a complication and then maybe a resolution. It also helps to have our students engage and adjust for who the audience is going to be. So these language goals help us as educators to really meet the expectation, not only of the content standard, but also help us to make certain that we know exactly what our students can and can't do. Okay, so the language functions help to outline very common language patterns that I would want my students to use to construct that narrative in language arts for this specific grade level cluster. These resources are available throughout the newest 2020 edition. And so it helps us to figure out what are the language resources that I need to work on? What are the things that I need to support my students? And what is going to be needed at each proficiency level to ensure that my students have equitable access to not only the expectation, but that language use of narrate? And what are they going to need to do in order to do that well? So our last talking point here that I wanted to just highlight quickly is with regards to these new grade level cluster materials, which I encourage you to explore. They really are helpful for us educators to help better understand what does that look like as we orient ourselves to that key use, but also what are the language functions and features that are going to help us to meet the language expectation of this specific task. So what you'll notice through this newest edition is a variety of ELD standard statements. It will have that key language use for you to explore. It will give you some ideas around language expectations. It will give you some more layered nuance information around function and feature, but it will also give you some information about how to support that at appropriate grade levels and also appropriate language proficiencies. So thank you so much for taking some time out today to kind of explore briefly some of the great features that you may find in the newest 2020 WIDA ELD framework.